Ok, bom dia a todos, a todas. Obrigado de novo por estar conosco nessas palestras e conversas que nós temos a cada duas, três semanas. Hoje nós temos uma convidada especial, Chanelle Gallant, que é uma feminista abolicionista que há mais de 25 anos luta pela libertação da sexualidade das mulheres, da criminalização. Ela atua na linha de frente como organizadora, escritora, pensadora, estrategista e é coautora do livro que aparece na chamada que a gente fez, que é o livro Not Your Rescue Project, Migrant Sex Workers Fighting for Justice. A Chanel contribuiu para dezenas de publicações influentes, entre elas Pleasure Activismo, Abolish Social Work, As We Know It e Defund, Disarm, Dismantle. Atualmente, ela é ativista pesquisadora, visitante no Centro for Feminism Research da Universidade de York, em Toronto. É um prazer imenso ter você aqui, Chanel, e muito obrigado por tomar um tempo no seu sábado para conversar conosco. Essa é uma conversa bastante importante para nós, imigrantes, a saber da experiência de um grupo que é bastante particular, mas é um grupo que tem, além do estigma, tem uma experiência de luta bastante importante para nós. Obrigado.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Alvaro, and to the interpreter for helping me understand it. Um, hi everyone. It's so good to be here with you today. It was so lovely to meet Alvaro at the Socialism Conference earlier this year. I was there with my co-author and a couple of other comrades talking about the work that we have done for many years, organizing immigrants in the sex industry. And yes, we two of us are co-authored this book, which is the first book that is rooted in the political struggles and organizing history of immigrants in the sex industry. And I have worked on issues related to criminalization, sex work, and racial justice for 25 years. And so this issue is very near and dear to me. I've worked with sex workers internationally in Canada, the US, Australia, Thailand, and um, and all over the world online. And this work, the work that we have done really comes out of understanding that what happens to migrants in the sex industry actually affects, first of all, is deeply misunderstood. And secondly, what's also misunderstood is how it affects migrants everywhere. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about in today, and I'd love to hear from you because I don't really like to just do a straight up lecture. I'd really prefer this to be a conversation. I want to hear your questions. Also, don't worry about your questions. I have heard every question there is. I've been doing this for 25 years. So there's no bad question. There's too simple a question, I'd love to hear it because I think it's really important for others as a jumping off point that people don't feel like they should know more. There's a reason you don't know more about this because, to give you an example of the level of misinformation, um, immigrants in the sex industry are the subjects of the first and longest running travel ban in the United States that goes back to 1875, and it's the Page Act. Most people have never even heard of the Page Act. Um, and why is ours the first book rooted in the resistance and organizing of immigrants in the sex industry? That's a result of 150 years and really longer than that of misinformation, suppression, and criminalization and stigma that have made it so difficult and so dangerous for immigrants in the sex industry to speak up, not to resist. They definitely have been doing that the whole time. But to get their voices out, their perspectives and their politics and their demands, It's not widely available. So I say that to kind of level set for where we're entering this conversation. Um, so I want to just, let's see, Alvaro, you wanted me to share, like, what are some of the insights from the organizing of immigrant sex workers that can inform broader immigrant justice movements and what's distinctive about their organizational forms, tactics, and political education. What a complex and good question. Um, but I want to start again by just being like, something I think is really important to get clear on before we get into it more deeply is, who are immigrant sex workers? Who are we talking about? Why are they here selling sex? What kinds of people, what kinds of immigrants are in the sex industry? And why have they migrated, et cetera, et cetera? So, um, the first thing I want to say is that everything you've been told about immigrants in the sex industry is propaganda. It comes from the perspective of a criminalizing state that wants to frame migrant sex workers as the victims of human trafficking so that it can justify and legitimize criminalization, detention, and deportation as a form of care, protection, and public safety. And in the last really since like in over the course of this year, really since Trump's administration, a lot more people have become sensitized and aware of the actual conditions for migrants inside of detention. A lot more people now know what an ICE raid looks like. But for years that I've been doing this work, most people still think that an ICE raid on a massage parlor is a rescue. Now, think in your mind about what you've seen about masked ICE agents kidnapping someone on the street because they participated in Palestine, pro-Palestine protests, kidnapping day laborers and tearing them apart from their families, sending them into what are effectively gulags, these sites of horror and abuse. That's what's happening in a raid on a massage parlor. But for our entire lives, we've been told by the police, by every form of law enforcement, Department of Homeland Security, that they busted up a sex trafficking ring and recovered women, right? That's, if you Google massage parlor and raid, and that's what you'll find. You'll find that women who were subject to a terrorizing encounter with law enforcement, they might have had the door broken down, they're all arrested. When you're told that immigrant sex workers are being rescued, they're literally all being arrested at gunpoint and taken into detention. But the story we've been told is that they've been rescued. So that's what I mean when I say it's propaganda. Being taken into a detention center in handcuffs and having all of your belongings, your phone, your money, and wages confiscated is obviously not a rescue. A rescue from what? The story really depends on a 500-year-old narrative in the United States that there are scary immigrant gangs trafficking women into the sex industry. And the reality is that many immigrant women, now we're going to get into who are women in the sex industry, immigrant women in the sex industry. The reality is that immigrant women in the sex industry are choosing it, and they're choosing it among a constrained set of options because it is their best employment option. That doesn't mean it's good or safe or protected. It doesn't mean the wages are necessarily great, but they're usually choosing it because the wages are 2 to 5 times higher than they could find in other labor sectors. Because the other labor sectors available to, think about a working class immigrant woman. Most women in like the massage sector, for example, are they're likely to be actually from their mid 30s to their mid 60s. They're much older than people realize.
Right.
And what kind of work do they have available to them? right? They might be so live-in caregiving, restaurant work, work in farms, fields, distribution centers. If you're a monolingual, non-English speaking immigrant woman, the job options available to you are in sectors that are extremely exploitative, very low paid, precarious, and often abusive. They might be subject to sexual harassment, sexual abuse, um, wage theft by their employers. They might be being paid less than minimum wage because their employers are exploiting workers who don't have documented status. So those are the alternatives. Now, compared to that, the sex industry pays, like I said, usually double. Now, that doesn't mean it's a lot of money, but that's a life-saving difference for someone who's like, let's say, a 40-year-old mother of two. She's a single mom, doesn't speak English, isn't documented, and can make double that wage. I mean, that's enormously beneficial for her and her family. Is she potentially subject to wage theft? Yes, but she would be in every other labor sector. Is she potentially subject to abuse and exploitation? Yes, but she would be unprotected in every other labor sector as well. What the sex industry offers to immigrant women is better wages is at the top. That's just so important. It's so critical to center that. It's just better money. And then potentially less disabling and debilitating working conditions. So very few people in the sex industry can't sit down, right? But a lot of the reason that women move into the sex industry after they've worked in other labor sectors is their bodies can't do it anymore. They can't they can't, I mean, have you ever seen or done picking lettuce or picking tomatoes or working in a distribution center? Those jobs are unbelievably difficult on the body in a way that more class privileged people don't ever have to experience. They might, we work with women who, they worked in fields where they had to get a pickup from the employer at 5 in the morning. So they'd have to be up at 4. We had other people who would work in freezing cold conditions, heat, standing. Workers in an Amazon distribution center walk an average of 10 to 30 miles per day. So compare that to a massage parlor or really any type of sex industry work, even a strip club, an in-call where people are doing full service sex work. You're sitting down. It's quiet between clients. If there's not a lot of work, you can do other things. The other really important factor for immigrants in the sex industry is that if you're working under the table, you're you are not tied. Your immigrant visa is not tied to your employer. So for most migrant workers, right, their ability to be in the United States is completely contingent on their job with one employer, which grants the employer a very dangerous amount of power. Because if that worker doesn't like the conditions or starts to unionize or organize and gets fired, they risk losing their status entirely. And for a lot of immigrants, they're not in the US because they want to be. They didn't necessarily migrate for fun. They're here because they need the money and or because conditions are too unsafe back home. So there's a lot riding on that status. But when you work in the sex industry, you work underground, which means if you don't like your employer, so people assume, for example, the sex industry is going to be more exploitative or more dangerous, more abusive than other industries. But, the trade-off of having no recognition and no labor protections, no migrant protections, is that they are not tied to an employer. So if a sex worker wants to move to another city, she wants to be closer to kids, or she's doing some schooling, or she's got friends and family in New York City or Miami, she can go there. right? So there is the second major reason that immigrants choose the sex industry is the mobility. So the first is money, and the second is mobility. And you'll never hear that story in reports about immigrants in the sex industry because mostly they don't even speak to them. Mostly the media, myself and my co-author are writing a guide right now on how to report about migrants in the sex industry. And at the most basic level, mostly journalists and writers don't even speak to them because they can't. They're in detention, but they don't mention that, right? Even when they're not, they don't speak to organizations of immigrant sex workers and find out why, what were they actually dealing with? And why were they choosing the sex industry? So I'm going to pause before I go into now the organizing strategies because I really wanted to be like, who are we talking about? What are they dealing with? Why are they choosing the sex industry? Because out of that comes the organizing strategies and tactics. But I want to pause and just ask folks, do you have any questions? Or what I'd love to hear was, what was the most surprising thing for you about what I just shared about who immigrants in the sex industry are? I'm going to pause and give you a little moment.
Someone who used to work in public safety, I found it fascinating that you were talking about what it means to like liberate people. There's a lot of propaganda around human trafficking, and just I think demystifying that is pretty powerful because law enforcement likes to run up numbers and also justify using further surveillance technology like facial recognition and seeing that be unpacked a little bit more is helpful. Like, I mean, it'd be helpful to think like what percentage of human trafficking that's being reported is actually sex workers.
Yes, thank you for that question. I'm gonna dive into that. I'd love to talk about that, but I want to just hear any other questions and then I'll address them all at the same time.
I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about their immigrant journey. Like, how did they get here? Does social media play a big role in this process? Things like that.
Also, great, fun question. Anybody else? Any other questions?
I have a question that is
Mhm.
that how that idea of a sexual worker that's criminalized is created. One thing that I thought in Chicago that was interesting, I went to your talk and then I went to a talk about uh, the terrorism and how that ideas of illegality, the terrorists, what you did on the war on terror is now being transferred for the war on immigrants, and how these things, and since that's a sector that's so stigmatized, so how that's used then and recycled on uh, other immigrants or other bodies.
Great. Okay. All right. I'm gonna get into those three. Wow. Fantastic questions. All very relevant. Okay, let's start with I'm going to start with the second question on their immigrant journey because I feel like that's kind of the quickest one. So the thing about migrants who sell sex is their immigrant journey is just like any other immigrant. They're usually not necessarily coming to be sex workers. They're just immigrant workers who are switching into another sector. Like they like think of the immigrant journey of anyone who is, not wealthy, not coming to the US on a visa that is for a business person or an investor. Just think about poor and working class immigrant, women and queer people. And then they're in the US or everywhere, actually, because migrant sex workers are in every country, because sex work is really such a important safety net, an economic safety net for specifically women and queer immigrants. So let's say you are a trans woman from Ecuador and you've come to the US seeking safety and the chance at survival and a better life. And you arrive in Chicago and no one will hire you. You try to work at anywhere, retail, nail salons, private security, you'll do anything, and no one will hire you, right? You've applied for asylum, but that process takes years. What are you going to do? There's no support. Under this type of economic system, right? This kind of brutal form of capitalism, you're on your own. And you need money immediately, right? And you're not eligible for healthcare. There's not affordable or subsidized housing. What are you going to do? And that's what people turn to the sex industry for. You form community that will help you learn how to protect yourself from law enforcement, from immigration, and from abusers who pose as clients, and you get to work. Or let's say you are, a non-English speaking Chinese woman, and you come to the US and with your husband becomes disabled, he can't work full time, and your wages now have to support two people. But you're living in the Bronx or Queens. How are you going to pay for the rent and the living expenses of two immigrant people in New York City? You try working in caregiving, you try working in restaurants, and the wages are just too low to survive. Meanwhile, you've got a friend who's working in the sex industry and things, the finances are much more uneven, but more, it's not like regular hours. But what the sex industry offers is it's one of the only industries where people can actually negotiate their wage with their employer. Tips. Tips in the sex industry can be higher than the base wage, which is unusual, right? A server at a restaurant is never getting more in a tip than the cost of the meal, but that actually that's not that uncommon in the sex industry. So that's not easy. There's no guarantees, there's no base wage, there's no protection. However, there is opportunity to do better economically. So that migration journey is actually just like other poor working class women and queer people. And when I say women, I always mean cisgender and transgender women. That's always included for me, right? But we do see a massive overrepresentation of transgender women in the sex industry because of the employment discrimination is so severe that they're often locked out of not only other labor sectors, but of education and training. The ability to just go to school, stay in school, complete some type of professional training or certification. So that's how I would answer that. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's basically just the same as any other migrant because the sex industry is just a labor sector that migrants are choosing between. And it is the best or only option. Okay, so then I'm going to get into, Jonathan, your question about propaganda, surveillance, what percentage of human trafficking arrests are actually sex workers? I mean, first of all, the vast majority of human trafficking arrests are of people involved in the sex industry. And that's because human trafficking laws are all written to criminalize the sex industry. And when I say all, I mean all. I mean everywhere. I mean every county, every state, and every country internationally. Because human trafficking laws were all developed by the United States, thanks, in the late 90s and early 2000s as a way to construct a new type of moral panic. And it really overlaps with your question, Alvaro, about the construction of illegality through this framework of human trafficking. If you're not sure about it, just Google any human trafficking law and then do a search for the word prostitution or sex. Why is it even in there? That's the actual only core function of those laws. They can expand to criminalize other behavior. But the core function of a human trafficking law is to criminalize people in the sex industry by constructing it as a form of violence and slavery. This is the United States defining the sex industry as the real source of slavery and immigrants as the real enslavers, not the bosses, not the capitalists at the top. So the way that they do this, for example, the US is the greatest producer of terrorism in the world, right? The US terrorizes people internationally through the military, but also through economic coercion and exploitative trade agreements that force tens of millions of people into unwanted migration, into poverty, into losing their land, into the destruction of land, to say nothing of their actual like detention facilities and prisons. And it's similar with trafficking. The United States produces the exploitation and abuse and unwanted movement of workers. But they define their enemies as the real traffickers. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, the idea of human trafficking or sex trafficking was developed. And this happened at a time when the United States wanted more tools to control and constrain the global flow of immigrant workers. Because in the late 90s, when you think back to that era, what was happening at that time, there was a mass movement suddenly of Eastern Europeans, but also trade was globalizing, right? The globalization of trade was accelerating, which meant a lot of companies were moving their corporations to where they could pay much, much lower wages and evade environmental and other kinds of labor protections. And so what the concept of human trafficking did was provide the United States and Europe with a rationale for much stricter border control and surveillance. Through this idea that there were tens of millions of women and children being trafficked around the world by these immigrant gangs. And in fact, what we see is tens of millions of women and children moving around the world because they've been displaced, right? But this was the construction of this dangerous threat to public safety, to the American family, and also played into all these racist stereotypes that the United States has always leaned on so heavily, that there's a dangerous sexual predator that the United States needs to keep out. And if you read the early language around human trafficking, there's always these words like predator and invasion, and now they'll use, these are all dog whistle racism terms: cartels, illegals, pimps, urban gangs. Those are all code words for dangerous men of color. And the original figure of the human trafficking victim was Eastern European and Southeast Asian. It was everywhere. Society was blanketed in stories, news reports, mostly with very scant evidence, that the Eastern European woman was now being trafficked. And therefore, the United States, had to defend the borders through massive investments in border surveillance, which is what they did after 9/11 with the whole concept of terrorism, right? They used the terrorism to build out a massive surveillance infrastructure, which would surveil Muslims in the United States. It was also used to criminalize Muslim organizing and Palestinian organizing, etc. And similarly, with the framework of human trafficking, this was leveraged to justify this idea that we were going to be protecting the women and children, which, by the way, those words are put together in order to infantilize women. Women in the sex industry are not the same thing as sexual abuse victims, but they're put together in order to legitimize that that police investigations and raids, arrests, and detentions are legitimate public safety. So to go back to the first question, what percent of human trafficking arrests are sex workers? It's actually sort of a trick question because human trafficking laws are written so broadly, they can all be used to conduct arrests of sex workers. So I think, and this will mostly be people of color. The majority of people who are arrested under human trafficking policies and laws, who are either charged or detained and deported, are people of color. And we're sold that this is actually freedom from slavery. Now, within that category of who's getting busted, it can be workers, it can be partners, it can be friends, it can be clients, it can be managers. Those managers can be bad bosses. They might be good bosses, they might be bad bosses. We can't tell. They're all dumped into this category of human trafficking, which doesn't distinguish between adult consensual sex work and an exploitative boss, right? And if you read reports about these arrests, the media will just repeat what the police claim as evidence of human trafficking will be. And it will be things like, that the women were being like held captive and they're just living at work, which many immigrant workers do. Many workers want to live at work, and especially if you're new to the country and trying to find housing in a very expensive urban market, it can be very preferable. Also, if you only work when clients come in, some workers want to live at work so that they're available when the work comes in. But those will be used as indicators of captivity. And racism is super important in this. Why would you think just because someone's living at work that they're kidnapped? They've been kidnapped and they're being forced to work. Well, because they'll always tell you directly or indirectly the race and country of the people who they claim were doing the kidnapping. Because they want you to imagine this nefarious situation where a sex workplace is seen as much more dangerous than an Amazon distribution center. And it isn't necessarily. Not that they're good, just saying, like I said at the top of this call, why they might be better. Do I feel to like cover some of anything I'm missing there? So, Jonathan just put into the chat, Hollywood really solidified that perception. Oh my God, did they ever? The Hollywood movies about human trafficking are nuts. They're so messed up. I can't watch them. They're nuts. They're just like, there's bad guys, gangsters, and there's these helpless women, and we need a tough guy who's willing to go in there. And they deeply romanticize violence. They don't give a shit about the person who's picking lettuce and strawberries in the fields of Central California, do they? Why not? because that serves them. That's great. That's what people are choosing the sex industry to get out of. They're rescuing themselves off the field. But capitalists do not want that. They want immigrant women available to them to work in their care facilities to take care of their parents. They want them working in the back room at the restaurant for less than minimum wage. They don't give a shit. They don't give a shit that someone working in the back room of restaurants in your city, anywhere we live, is being paid less than minimum wage washing dishes because they're undocumented. Go deal with that. That is the class and race and migration reality. And what we've been fed is a cop hero story. Immigrant women save their own damn selves. They are not being rescued by some cop. They're literally being put in handcuffs and robbed. When you also read reports on raids on sex work businesses, they'll often describe how much money they seized. Whose money do you think that was? Because those workers were living at work. That includes their wages. They don't get to keep that. So a raid on an immigrant sex work business is a state-authorized armed robbery and kidnapping. Nobody called it a kidnapping before this year. When we would describe the violence of a raid on a sex work business, it was not seen as a kidnapping. Now people have seen the videos and they're like, whoa, that's a kidnapping. It was before too. Now I'm going to segue into what do we have to learn? Okay. One thing here, there's two really important things I want to talk about. One is that if you don't pay attention to what's happening to immigrants in the sex industry, you are missing the canary in the coal mine. They are building the infrastructure to use against all immigrants. They first do it on sex workers because they know no one is going to protect them or stand up for them. Part of that is because you're so deprived of information, you don't even really understand what's happening, and the situation just feels kind of complicated. Like, I don't really know. Those seem like bad guys. I mean, maybe that was better than the alternative. Even I've had someone say that to me about women who had rifles pointed at them at work. They were lined up outside of their massage parlor. This person was anti-police, but they still have this idea in their head, maybe it's just so bad what's happening in there that this is better. That's how, even if it's not indifference, if you don't dislike sex workers, you don't hate them, but you don't understand what's happening, and then you let it happen. You let it become normalized, and also they fund it. They develop programs, they develop the funding, they develop the kind of legal and social precedent to attack immigrants in their worksite. Worksite raids were already happening. That's a massage parlor raid. Undercover kidnappings. Yes, that's undercover officers investigating a sex work business, like a massage parlor. Facial recognition surveillance. They were doing that against sex workers. They've been doing that since they invented it. But like literally the first immigration ban, even the first, you know how we have photos in our passports? I mean, that seems very normal, right? Of course. Why wouldn't you? How could you? You need these identifications. Well, they first introduced photos on immigrant documentation because they were trying to stop sex workers coming in from China. They wanted to ensure that the person who had gone through the immigration questioning in Hong Kong before they were allowed to come to the US was the same person who arrived on the boat. Because, immigrants were outsmarting the American border system, and they would have someone else go to the interview with the US consulate, then who would arrive on the borders. And so that was introduced and then expanded. So this idea that the surveillance used against the sex industry is then expanded, and the criminalization, is as old as immigrant regulation in the US. That is not new. That did not start last year or last decade. That is 150 years old. So do people know about Palantir? Have folks heard of Palantir? Does anyone want to say, can anyone just a little, like, what is Palantir?
It's like a surveillance network aggregating a lot of data, personal data, dark web data, public data, essentially creating like a profiles on every person like on Earth or on the United States at least.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. Other people can always summarize this better than I can. Um, and it's owned by Peter Thiel, one of these South African apartheid-loving tech billionaires. Now they have been working with yes, and Jonathan put in the chat a neo-Nazi. Yes, many of them are. Many of them actually have extremely fascist political views, and have historical connections to apartheid era South Africa. And Peter Thiel's company, Palantir, has been partnering with the National Human Trafficking Hotline since 2012. They go way back. But no one thought Palantir was a real danger to the rest of us again until recently. That's the canary in the coal mine effect. If you had been listening to sex workers saying, hey, these anti-human trafficking supports are not, they're actually just surveillance. In fact, they're the collaboration between state and corporate surveillance through this intermediary of a nonprofit, which is Polaris, a national anti-trafficking organization. That's what fascism is, right? It's the collaboration and the unification of state power and corporate power. And anti-human trafficking nonprofits serve as the intermediary that brings them together. So that's what Polaris did. It brought together, Palantir, this surveillance company, and law enforcement, which it shares information with, and DHS and Homeland Security, through a nonprofit called Polaris. And that's what the anti-human trafficking sector does. It allows collaboration between the tech sector surveillance and law enforcement. So when you see numbers that are like, our nonprofit supported X number of human trafficking victims, I've been in this for a quarter century, and I know that those numbers don't mean anything, and I don't know what they mean, because that could mean anyone who called the hotline. It could mean anyone who they think is at risk of sex trafficking, and what they mean is at risk of engaging in sex work. I don't know how they come up with that. They can just kind of make this up, right? But that's the canary in the coal mine that got missed. Sex workers were talking about Palantir a decade ago. Now they've got all our data because people were like, well, I don't know. Why weren't they listening? They didn't understand what it meant. They didn't understand the danger. So that's one thing that I think is really important. The second thing I'm going to say is really important is that sex workers, like all undocumented people, and I'm just going to say migrant sex workers have every immigration status, from citizen to asylum seeker to temporary foreign worker, everything. Anyone can sell sex. Like, lots of people moonlight in the sex industry. It isn't necessarily an identity. It's just a job people do. So every single immigration status. However, like undocumented people, what migrant sex workers are really good at is non-compliance. They're really good at understanding how to be clandestine in a police state. How do you get what you want and need? How do you Do what you want to do. How do you retain autonomy and go where you wanted to go? Be who you want to be with. Use your body how you want to use it in a police state. That's hard, right? That's very hard because that's what they're trying to stop, right? And that's what the US is increasingly becoming. It's increasingly authoritarian with very strict limits on speech, association, expanding criminalization of dissent, restrictions on the media. But I mean, I've just been telling you for almost an hour how, yeah, the media already wasn't ever telling you the truth about immigrants in the sex industry. And so migrant sex workers teach us how do you not just survive, but how do you retain control? And I mean, I'd be curious to hear from other folks. What do you think? How do people retain control over their mobility and their bodies under very intense scrutiny and surveillance and criminalization? Your movement is illegal, your relationships are illegal, your work is illegal. Then what? How do you think people do it? I want to hear from some folks. I'll pause. I'll wait a minute. I've talked a lot.
I mean, nobody's going, I'm going. I think that this is an important point because one thing that I think and it's always, to me, is an incredible point of admiration of immigrants is their capacity of first the journey of living across an ocean, coming to a country, knowing nothing, and don't know the language, and then develop an incredible capacity of surviving a system that make them illegal, make their work illegal. And we've seen now, even with ice in the street, the networks that are being created there, WhatsApp groups, people communicating with other people. So it's an incredible capacity of organizing, and sometimes we don't see this as organizing because we have a kind of non-profit model of organization, but we are seeing this in this country. In Boston, we see the capacity of Brazilians, lawyers, and organizations, and immigrants themselves, and the radios and the newspaper, to creating these survival mode on a very repressive state that makes everything that they are illegal. They are criminals, they are rapists. I mean, you see in the words of the president that it to me is always a courage that I don't have.
A courage you don't have. Is that
Yeah,
what you said?
yeah, of making that journey and
Yes.
and living and surviving and send your kids to school and
Yeah, it's
creating
incredible.
business and
Yes, it is incredible. That's what people do. Yeah, they leave home, they find ways to support their families, they create businesses, they survive. I will say that my experience of how people do it, how do people do this, is organizing. Organizing outside of nonprofits. That's how people survive. So when you talk about the capacity that people have to tap into, they do that. It's actually their networks who will help them do that. Figure out, how do I do this? How do I survive this? You're talking about people who might also still be facing domestic violence, lots of other things happening, aging parents, they lose their job, like the car breaks down. They cannot survive this without their networks. And that mostly happens outside of nonprofits, including the second thing is intelligence. You share information. Where is enforcement happening right now? Who tells immigrants, oh, hey, I hear they're hitting this neighborhood? Other immigrants. You're like out without networks. You cannot survive. You'll get picked up. You won't have the money. You'll work for a boss that you don't know is really bad. You'll see clients who are abusive because nobody has warned you. You can't survive without networks. That is how immigrants do it. And it's the same in the sex industry as anywhere else. And what we're seeing now is this intensification of criminalization, right? Where undocumented people can just guns drawn in front of their children. That's always been the case for sex workers. So you're seeing just now you're getting to actually see what's been happening quietly for 150 years when those immigrants were in the sex industry. It's all mutual aid. It's all networks of organizing. How someone survives when they go work on the street is they have another worker who watches the license plate, takes down the license plate and the description of the car, right? So that there's some accountability and women are not just disappearing into a car with a client, right? But they also know that the police might not bother to investigate even if they have the license plate number. So they have to share intelligence and capacity. How do you assess? How do you screen to make sure that you're only going with someone who is safe and is not a cop? How do you screen for cops? Sex workers have to share that information with each other. Also, how do you keep going when you've experienced violence at work or at home through domestic violence, but you still need to go back to work the next day? Where are you going to find that capacity? It will be your sisters who will help you. That's who. It's not a nonprofit. And don't get me wrong, not to disparage nonprofits, but for people who are surviving under that level of criminalization, it's each other, it's networks. And so I'm going to finish with solidarity, the cross movement solidarity. The most fun part of this all. Oh, I have a pause. Or I see a hand up from Patricia. Did you want to ask a question, Patricia?
No, just I want to add that people are using creativity as well. There are
Yes.
those enough WhatsApp groups that people are using a lot of mechanisms to try to screening if there is some, eyes over there, drones to try to see if it's dangerous to go for to schools or to just do their normal life, to live their normal life. So creativity, I think, is the word.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, because actually I forget to say creativity, but my co-author and comrade usually mentions it as one of the most important things. First thing that she'll mention is creativity. I think people want a recipe. They want a guide, principles. What can we do? But actually creativity where you don't know, you're going to have to flow, is crucial for survival. I absolutely agree. Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. Thank you for mentioning that, which means we need to teach creativity. We need to recognize it and value it. Okay, well, if creativity is important for surviving, how can we support that with each other? How can you support the creativity of immigrants in the sex industry? I would say, first of all, don't judge how people choose to survive. They really know their safety best. They really know the threats better than you and I. Way better. Way better. And sometimes you'll get social workers in there being like, okay, how are we going to help you? Like, no. Give them money and let them figure out their own problems, right? The thing about cross-movement solidarity, we talk about this in the final chapter of the book. The first thing I would say actually is to get grounded in your own interest in solidarity so that you don't come at it from a place of saviorism or pity. Why do you need sex workers to have more power? Immigrant sex workers to have more power? Why do you care? Why does it benefit you? And it does. It absolutely does. But it's important for you to reflect on that first so that you don't come in with this idea that you're helping, but rather as a comrade in struggle, where we have to form coalitions in order to become stronger together. That's why. You need what immigrants in the sex industry have. They understand criminalization at such a deep level and networks of survival outside of the state at such a deep level. Those are two things I would say. Okay, it looks like Miguel, do you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Bom, primeiro eu queria agradecer ao EDB pela iniciativa e também a convidada por compartilhar informações importantes de um tema pouco divulgado, mas de extrema importância, que é o tráfico de pessoas para exploração sexual. A minha pergunta seria com relação esse, principalmente esse imigrante que é explorado, tem alguma pesquisa que já mensurou a contribuição que ele tem nas remessas para o seu país de origem e a contribuição, embora ele não tenha, embora ele não tenha talvez registros tão formais como uma outra pessoa morando nos Estados Unidos, ele contribui com a sociedade, ele consome, ele paga seus impostos de uma forma ou de outra. Se existe já alguma pesquisa que possa mensurar isso, essa contribuição, e se talvez se esse fosse um caminho para mostrar uma visibilidade e uma humanidade dessas pessoas e que elas também devem ser vistas como cidadão no seu país de origem, porque contribui com remessas, no país onde ela está vivendo, contribuindo localmente. Eu moro em Tóquio, Japão, e a situação eu vou entender que é similar, talvez com um pequeno agravante de que o país culturalmente com, com xenófobo. É um país que não que já está na sua história esse tipo de tratamento com estrangeiros. Obrigado.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, about what data do we have that show the contributions? I mean, first of all, it is very difficult to get accurate data about sex workers, and especially about immigrant sex workers because of criminalization and stigma. So often the research is biased, or it's very difficult to do good research on people who are being criminalized for good reason, right? They cannot take the risks of participating in research projects. However, having said that, I have seen research by the International Labor Organization that documented that I believe it was the average sex worker is supporting 5 to 8 family members. And that's roughly what I remember. And I could find that research and share that. I can send that to Alvaro after this call. But yes, you point to something, which is that migrant sex workers are often the economic backbone of their entire family. They are working abroad for the same reasons that other migrant workers are, which is to support family back home. And they are, like I said, typically earning better wages than they might in other labor sectors, which is not high wages, but better, meaning they can send a larger portion of their income back home. And they do this without recognition, without being seen as providers. But in fact, many migrant sex workers are providers for their families, but then also for their community more broadly. There are so many community projects that have been quietly funded through money that came through the sex industry. The ingenuity of sex workers who figured out how to get more money out of their clients so that they could pass that on to their community. In my experience, the sex work community, sex workers are often very generous with their resources, with their families, their friends, their communities. And I think partly because they're drawn from poor and working class immigrant women, where there is a strong cultural norm of supporting those around them. Yeah. And I think sex workers fall within that. So I will find that research from the International Labor Organization and share that with Elvira after this call. Thank you for your question. The last thing I want to end on maybe is one comment around you don't have to understand or like sex work. You have to be able to see your shared interest in building solidarity with sex workers and understand how it makes all of us stronger. And on that basis, find your shared point, whatever it is. Maybe it's that you know what it's like to leave home. You know what it's like to have to work hard for a living. You know what it's like to experience poverty or displacement. But any of those points can be places of connection with immigrants in the sex industry and a place from which to build authentic solidarity and strength and mutual learning. And I'm going to finish there.
So thank you. I just want to say one thing that in Chicago to me was very, it caught my attention. There was, by accident, I talked to this person before your talk and then after, and he is one old socialist and militant, and he asked the question about women selling their bodies. And I remember your question say they're not selling their bodies, they take their bodies home, they are selling sex, which is to me was a part of how difficult it is for folks to understand that as an industry and as work and not some scene or people selling their bodies. And I thought it was interesting that a socialist militant of more than 50 years still had a language that's very common and couldn't reflect on, and that caught my attention that there is something wrong with us, that we needed to have that conversation and straighten up some
That
of
idea. Yeah.
ideas and language. And
Yeah. It is very common. It's a very common misperception that it's rooted in both a sexist idea that women are defined by our bodies and sexuality, and even more specifically, our genitals. This is a patriarchal idea that all of our existence as women is reducible to our sexuality. And if we sell sex, then that means that we are nothing more than that, right? And it's also a historical conflation between sex work and slavery, which is a very deliberate ideology that has been promoted, that the person who sells sex, that if you sell a massage, you sell a service. But if that massage includes genital touch, now it's slavery. Now you've sold your body. That doesn't make any sense, right? If you sell someone a picture, you sell someone a dance, you sell someone companionship, you're selling a service, just like anyone else selling a service. And we can really see that by looking at massage, how strangely arbitrary this is. As long as the massage doesn't include the genitals, we understand it's a job. That's a job. If the massage includes the genitals, now it's not a job. It can't be a job. Now you've sold your body. You've sold your soul. You've sold your dignity. You've sold your self-respect. You've sold your safety. Oh my God, it's a tragedy. It's the danger to marriage and public safety and national security. There's a lot of very high feelings which don't correlate to how significant the service is. Sex is not that big a deal, guys. It doesn't matter that much to sex workers. It's not the most precious thing about them, right? But it's Catholicism and it's patriarchy and it's capitalist control over immigrant labor that has turned sex into this massive deal. That's why we have to have this conversation about something that is not that big a deal, not that important. It's just not that important. Did you have sex for free or did it cost $200? Who cares? Who cares? But we've all been told that this is literally a matter of international security. No, it's not. No. So we need to bring that back down to size. And I understand his question. This is what I meant. It's fine. It doesn't offend me. People who are supportive of sex workers, and that man was, say things like, okay, well, women who sell their bodies. I've had lots of people who are very pro-sex work say that. It's just a confusion. It's an ideology they haven't uprooted. It's inherited sexism and whorephobia. And that's fine. We pointed out, oh, you might not realize that's actually a very anti-sex worker ideology. And then people change. And he did. He was very open to that idea because another sex worker in the room immediately shot her arm up and said, we don't sell our bodies. We sell sex. That's fine. And then he was gracious about it and he took the lesson and that's fine. We're all like that. We're all learning. Think of how many things that we were all saying that were that were ableist or anti-Black, and we didn't realize until somebody told us. And it's the same thing with sex work. We come up in a society that teaches us these ideas, and then we can all learn from each other, right? This is why we need these kinds of dialogues. So thank you so much for creating this space, Alvaro. This has been really, really lovely.
Thank you. I think we passed the hour. We already abused your time on a
No, not at
Saturday.
all. It's been a pleasure. My Saturday morning. It has been a pleasure spending it with you.